Leo, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Um, that history is very interesting. I also wanted to start with Milton Friedman, but more from an economic standpoint. Uh, I I think that Friedman had also some very strong views about public education. He Public education was a monopoly. And his two main arguments for vouchers in the 1955 article, and then which was reproduced in '62 in the book Capitalism and Freedom, and these are important to keep in mind. These arguments because they really set the stage for subsequent work, which I'll quickly review for you about voucher experiments and large-scale voucher programs. Uh, he he argued for vouchers on two economic grounds. The first was that public education was a monopoly, and as a monopoly, it essentially charged more for education than it should really cost. It monopoly priced. Now, I'm not going to go into that. In my economics of education class, I show the argument in economic terms. But basically, what he was arguing was that as a monopoly, public schools could essentially restrict effort on the part of teachers and administrators, and therefore schooling costs more than it should to the public. So that's what he wanted to introduce was private schools as a form of competition that would reduce the cost of schooling, produce the same amount of student output, but for a lower price. He was very consistent on this point. I debated him, by the way, I have to admit that he was one of my professors at the university where I got my PhD. And afterwards, when he came to Stanford, I debated him on a couple of occasions. And in both cases, these were at the time when California was first statewide voucher initiative occurred in 1993. There was another one in 2001. Both of them failed, and Friedman consulted on both of them. And in both cases, the value of the voucher that was proposed in that statewide initiative was exactly half the price of the cost per student in public schools. And Friedman argued that private schools should be able to provide the same quality of schooling for half the price. So one of his arguments, therefore, was this argument that schooling would be cheaper, and it would drive down, competition would drive down the cost of public schooling. The second point that he made was that it would increase welfare because welfare in the economic sense. What's interesting, referring now back to what Leo laid out, was that Friedman felt that this would particularly benefit low-income kids of color because they had fewer options in terms of where they could move to attend public schools than did the wealthier families. And you hear this argument all the time, and that is that basically school vouchers are an alternative to schools that are socially segregated and racially segregated. So, in speaking back to Leo's point, I think it's really important to understand that Friedman believed that markets would solve the racial integration problems and was totally against any government intervention that would would try to fix this problem. In any case, there have been lots of voucher experiments since Friedman wrote all this stuff. And there have been requests in New York and Washington, in Dayton, in Cleveland. These are originally small-scale experiments. You're going to hear later, I understand, about the most recent DC voucher. But the original DC vouchers were back in the late 90s. And in Chile, in Milwaukee, in Sweden, and there have been, I guess you could call it a voucher program in Holland since the 1920s, but that was basically to take care of the religious division in their country. Anyway, these large-scale programs exist, and there have been large-scale programs in the U.S. Since 1998 in Milwaukee, the Florida program, tax credits given to corporations, since the Florida Constitution does not allow public funding to go to religious schools, and now most recently in Louisiana and Ohio. And these programs have all been evaluated. Lots of stuff has been written about these programs, and there have been some very, very careful evaluations done of them. The small-scale programs have been experiments, and they have been evaluated as experiments. In other words, they've random assignment to the program for low-income kids. In the U.S., they're all targeted programs. That means that their vouchers are only available to people who meet certain low-income requirements. In Chile and Sweden, they are not targeted programs. They are national. Everybody can take a voucher. The most recent ones in Louisiana, Ohio, are also targeted, and they're large scale. So there are three main points to pay attention to on these on the vouchers in terms of what they do. The first point is, do they improve the actual school achievement or even school attainment of the kids that attend private schools compared to kids like them that attend public schools? Secondly, does the competition, as Milton Friedman argued, does the competition improve public schools and therefore improve everybody's achievement and attainment because of the increased competition from from more efficient private schools? And a third thing we should pay attention to is whether there are costs to the vouchers. So is there increased segregation, social segregation? Is there cream skimming? In other words, do the private schools, the public schools? And does it have other effects, such as reducing the incentive for people to go into teaching, for example, because of the greater role played by private schools in the overall system? So I've had some papers passed out to you. There's a very long evaluation done by some economists, which is quite good, which goes through all of the programs that I've mentioned. But let me just quickly tell you about three cases, which I think are the most important to look at. First of all, there's the city of Milwaukee. And Milwaukee is basically an all-choice district. There are about 120,000 kids in Milwaukee, if I remember correctly. Might be a little bit less now. But it is total choice. In other words, you have about almost 30,000 kids, about 28,000 kids who are on vouchers going to private schools. You have charter schools. You have choice among public schools. So only about 25% of Milwaukee kids go to their neighborhood public school. The rest attend some other choice school that, in the city. Milwaukee up and down. There's been a 4-year evaluation of whether the kids in private schools who are on vouchers, whether they do better than their counterparts in public school. There have been no significant effects shown that can be attributed to the vouchers themselves. And there is a small attainment effect in high school. We don't know exactly why that is, but Milwaukee as a whole has really not done very well under all this choice. It is among the urban areas that are tested by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Among the bottom two, is in the bottom two. The other one is Detroit, which also has a choice, a very extensive choice program. But Milwaukee's been doing this now on a large scale since 1998, so 20 years. And one cannot say that vouchers and choice in general have had a very salutary effect on the kids in Milwaukee. Chile is a national program that's been going on since 1981. In Santiago, the largest city, which has about a sixth of the population of Chile, about 70% of kids attend private schools and only about 30% public schools. And overall in the country, about 50% of kids attend now private schools of one kind or another, of which all but about 15% are voucher schools. Now, Chilean test scores on international tests have gone up in the last 15 years, but as you'll read in this article that I passed out, not my article, but the other one, if you read that, you'll understand that the Chileans have done an awful lot of other things, and there's no evidence that vouchers really contributed to the increase in test scores. And there's no evidence in Chile that despite the fact that it's a national program, that increased competition really helped public schools improve. Now, the Chileans tripled teachers' salaries in the 1990s. They now spend 50% more on low-income kids than on very low-income kids. And all those things seem to have had positive effects on kids' performance in school, but not vouchers. In Sweden, they're mixed effects. There's some evidence that the Swedes have been able to, that their competition has had some effect on the performance of public schools, but it's a mixed thing. So to conclude, vouchers did not achieve overall or consistently any of the predicted benefits that were claimed. Parents may have felt better having choice. There are some studies showing that. There's a study in Washington, D.C., showing that after 3 years, parents who went, these were about charter parents, parents who had choice, actually started behaving very much like public school parents, complaining about their schools and not being satisfied. But on average, the results for the children and for those who stayed in the public schools are no better than if the vouchers were never introduced. So you can argue that there were no real negative effects of the vouchers, either cream skimming or increased segregation, although there's some evidence that in some places there are increased segregation effects, like in Chile, but these effects are not huge. However, What is evident is that vouchers and other privatization schemes distract from introducing reforms that are shown to have really large effects on kids' performance and on attainment, such as increasing spending on low-income kids and low-income schools. There's some recent work in the United States that shows that the adequate school movement the adequate spending movement has had a positive effect on low-income school districts. There is a very persuasive evidence from Chile that increasing spending on low-income kids has a big effect on their performance, and other kinds of reforms such as improved teacher preparation, pre-service preparation, and curricular reforms by states, and systematic accountability in states, and accompanied by technical assistance for those districts that aren't performing well. All of this stuff works. There are states like Massachusetts that have implemented a lot of these reforms, and they're doing great. They have had very big improvements in their test scores. They are among the highest scoring countries. If Massachusetts were a country, it would be one of the higher scoring countries in the world on international tests. And there are other states doing well too. Minnesota, Texas has done well in the past, hasn't done so well in the last few years on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. All these states introduced reforms of public schools that work, and vouchers distract from those reforms. And that may be the highest cost of focusing on vouchers. Thank you.